Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of the Economic Forces podcast. I'm Brian Albrecht of Kennesaw State, and I'm joined by Josh Hendrickson, who's at Ole Miss. This podcast is meant to supplement our weekly newsletter, which you can find at pricetheory.substack.com. If you'd like to support this podcast and our newsletter, make sure to subscribe. Who's our guest today, Josh?
Today's guest is Henry Thompson. He's a PhD candidate at George Mason. He will also be my colleague at Ole Miss this fall. So it's my podcast, and so we can just start interviewing all my colleagues, I guess. So we normally start up with kind of like a warm-up question. And so maybe you could tell us sort of broadly like how you got into economics and how you ended up at George Mason.
Yeah, sure. Well, before I get into that, I just want to say that it's a real pleasure and honor to be on the podcast. I think I think I might have subscribed to you guys' Substack, I think on the very first day or within the first week. So I've been following your guys' journey for a long time. And I listen to all the episodes. I read all your guys' stuff. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So
thanks for that.
Thank you.
Your paycheck for that comment will be in the mail soon.
He just knows that I'm going to have to evaluate his tenure packet.
Yeah. We won't bring that up, gentlemen. That's confidential information. But going back to Josh's original question. So I had a kind of a different, I guess, spiritual awakening, if you will, relative to most. I had I double majored at Clemson in both economics and political science. And at the time, I was really interested by the time I was like applying to graduate schools, I was really interested at the intersection of a kind of philosophy, institutional analysis, and kind of political science type stuff. And I was like looking at it for the best program that Mason to me seemed like an awesome fit. And so obviously got in, ended up going there for the first year and a half. And then at the end of, or in December, a year and a half into my program, at the suggestion of Pete Becky, I bought Alshin's collected works. He's like, you should probably read this stuff, help you improve a paper, and like read through it. And, that'll help you kind of figure out how to make an argument or think about I was working on a paper on economics and religion at the time. It's like, just go read Alshin. Okay, sounds good. So I go and I read that, and it blew my mind. I read through that, and in particular, his paper with the Alshin, Crawford, and Klein paper on asset specificity completely changed the way that I looked at economics. Completely changed, and very fortuitously, in the following semester, I had an opportunity to take a class with Pete Leeson, which was he was teaching non-market decision making at the time, and kind of in conjunction with that, it was basically reading that paper and reading all of Alshin's stuff, and then following that, having a class where I got to basically talk to Pete Leeson every single day, completely reshaped the way that I approach economics and what I actually wanted to do. And since basically that very formative spring semester, I've only ever really been thinking about transaction costs and institutions and trying to use the economic way of thinking to try and understand various institutions, which as of right now happen to be criminal. So that's kind of the long-winded long story that kind of to talking about my development, how I ended up getting here.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more before we get into your paper on Costa Nostra Courts, which we'll spend a long time on, your job market paper. Say a little bit more about what you see as that approach. So you said transactions costs, but how would you characterize the way you approach problems, and maybe bring in Leeson as a reference as well, that people may know how you guys approach problems versus other people at GMU, which maybe have a slightly different take, or other people within the profession as a whole?
Yeah. So I think the very first thing to kind of keep in mind is that we're asking very different questions. That's the very first thing. And so if you're trying to think about the questions that we're trying to ask is like, what are the factors that explain, or the reasons behind a particular set of formal or informal institutions? And for us, at the very least, and this is, following from what Pete ended up teaching me is like, okay, well, we need to think about the best means with which we can try and understand the various determinants behind a particular set of institutions. And it just so happens that price theory and rational choice and basic economics, to our mind, is the most persuasive way of trying to identify and trying to understand those particular institutions. And Pete has done an amazing job in showing just how he's basically pushing the boundaries on the extensive margin on what institutions we can actually try and understand with economics. So as you guys are, I'm sure, are aware, but your listeners might not, Pete's done a lot of awesome work on criminals and superstition, right? You would never anticipate economics to apply to something like superstition, but Pete is very clever and is very good at what he does. And he's able to offer really persuasive arguments that show the economic principle. He's able to kind of elucidate the economic reasoning behind stuff like oracles, ingesting people who ingest poison, witch trials, trials by fire, trials by combat, like all of these super weird, like what other people would think are weird institutions, but I think are super interesting and awesome to think about. He's able to actually try and explain them. And everything that he does and everything that I try and do as well is like just approach it through very basic economic reasoning, which is people face constraints and differences in behavior are ultimately explained not by some sort of ad hoc behavioral explanation, but rather by different people behave differently because they face a different set of constraints. So if you see something out there in the world that doesn't kind of comport with what you would otherwise understand, or like that seems inefficient, if you will, I was going to try and time myself how long it would take for me to bring up the word efficiency. You've identified the wrong constraint, and you need to think a little bit more carefully about the sorts of constraints. And I find that particularly useful because it allows you to rule out competing hypotheses when like push comes to shove. It's like, okay, did we identify the right constraint? And when you get like actually go to the history, or go to the empirics, does that actually hold up?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's comports, I think, pretty. Is that the right word? It fits with a lot that we're pushing. That maybe things that look weird on the surface aren't so weird. We could talk about efficiency or rationality or whatever that is. So that's kind of the broad overview of the areas looked at. As I said, we're going to talk about your job market paper, Costa Nostra Courts, particularly around criminal organizations. So how did that project come about within this broader? Okay, we're going to attack everything with rational choice. Now, where do we get to Costa Nostra Courts?
So it was actually the result of another paper that I had to put on the back burner for some period of time, because I was reading through a bunch of 1920s, 1910s, early 20th century newspaper articles, working on a paper trying to understand
as one does.
Principle.
All economists
Precisely.
read 1920s news articles. Typical.
That's right. But the subject matter of these articles was interesting. It was like basically it was very early criminal organizations, and I was able to find kind of what got me onto this project is I was able to find a couple of constitutions of early criminal organizations and early mafia organizations in particular. And I noticed that there were these two kind of key organizations, or these kind of proto-mafias, if you will, who had differences in entrance requirements. One, you basically had to kill a guy and go through this kind of very rigorous screening process, while this other organization, you pay $20 and then you're in. It was like very, very different. It's like, what the heck? Like, what explains the differences in the entrance requirements? And I worked on that paper for 6 months. I thought I had a pretty clever argument for it, which is like one had very good protection of its reputation and the other one didn't. And so as a result, the one that didn't have better protection on its reputation had lower entrance requirements because members didn't expect to earn as much. So basically, you could anticipate a higher price upon entering the organization for the one that could better protect its reputation. But I got 6 months into that project. I worked really hard. I poured my heart and soul into that project. I get 6 months in and I realized that the key difference in the entrance requirements was misattributed to a different organization that was doing something completely different. So there was really no way to compare the two. And it broke my heart because I really worked hard on the paper. I had a great title and like very nice economic reasoning. But I was basically screwed over because of poor journalism. And it really frustrated me. And so I spent the next couple of weeks basically saying to myself, I'm going to go and try and find the most credible and reliable evidence I can find on mafia organizations. And after a couple of weeks of reading a bunch of different articles, newspaper articles, and just Googling, a bunch of Googling and books as well, I came across the Mary Farrell Foundation. And the Mary Farrell Foundation has basically started to compile a bunch of recently declassified FBI reports pertaining to the Kennedy assassination. And so apparently the mafia is related to the Kennedy assassination. And so they have a bunch of files that are basically informed by either current members or former members or close associates of La Costa Nostra, the American Mafia. And I was like, this is awesome. And what was particularly cool about these files, first of all, there are thousands. There's a ton to read, and so it's like very high upfront fixed cost. But once you actually get to reading it, it's super, super interesting. There's a lot of really good information about this institution called the Argumenta, which I ultimately call in the paper these Costa Nostra Courts, which are more colloquially called sit-downs. And I realized that these sit-downs happen all the time. And these guys, it like seems to be a key mechanism for basically keeping things running smoothly within La Costa Nostra. It's like that, I need to try and explain this. This is something really important because I haven't seen, because I read stuff by Pete on pirates, I'd read stuff by Scarbeck on prison gangs, and those criminal organizations don't appear to emphasize similar arbitration institutions in the same way. So it's like, this could be something quite interesting. And that ended up kind of turning into the job market paper that it is now. But I guess good things kind of turned out in the end. It was super frustrating in the short run, but it inspired me to kind of find a much, much cooler data set than just simply looking through newspaper articles. So I'm not doing that again. That's the kind of lesson. It's like, I almost exclusively don't rely on newspaper articles now.
So before we get into the specifics, I kind of want to ask you a bigger picture question. So when you think about things like prison gangs, or you think about the mafia or something like that, I think most people probably think of this stuff as being the sort of subject that like sociologists would study, right? And so why is economics so useful, like when we're thinking about these kinds of organizations? Like, what do we provide that nobody else is kind of providing when we analyze this stuff?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in comparative advantage, and my position is the following: anthropology, history, sociology, a lot of statistical stuff. It performs a really important function, which is basically fact finding, right? They identify certain patterns, certain empirical patterns in the world. And I think it's the economist's comparative advantage to basically try and explain differences in the patterns. And they basically take what's been done as given and then try and explain differences. And so when it comes to something like sociology or anthropology, a lot of those guys focus a lot on institutions that are largely informal. And so one might come along and say, well, economics, why aren't you talking about, like, I don't know, to kind of make a straw man out of it. It's like, why aren't you talking about stocks and bonds? It's like, because economics, my position is the following: economics is a universal theory of human choice. And so we can leverage that in order to try and explain the differences in the different patterns other people have found. And it's particularly important because it allows us to get away from ad hoc theorizing. So if you actually, I've read a bunch of anthropology, I've read into sociology, because those are the guys who actually are writing about criminal organizations, and they can offer kind of random explanations for the persistence of a particular institution or why people do things, but it's obviously not nearly as internally coherent or externally falsifiable as I think as economists might be able to actually contribute. And that's, I think, where we can really, where the marginal benefit of economics is highest, is actually trying to push the boundaries of economic theory into areas where we wouldn't anticipate it to actually apply. And that applies in particular. So economic imperialism, to kind of put a name on it, is I think part and parcel of what economics does, because wherever you see human action happening, people making decisions, economics has something interesting to say about it.
So going into the Costa Nostra a little bit, so any organization, any group of people, they have economic problems of allocating resources, of lowering transactions costs, however you want to frame it. Kind of what are the unique things for Costa Nostra, both relative to above ground organizations of the problems that they need to solve and relative to other criminal organizations? What is the unique economic problem that requires a unique economic response?
So relative to non-criminal organizations, criminals face a particularly important problem, which is that they are criminals. So there are actually two problems that criminals face. One, they don't actually have access to an independent enforcer of property rights and contracts. So insofar as you have two criminals who get into a dispute, or one guy fights another guy, or like tries to rob another guy, you can't call the cops, right? Because you also are a criminal, and by calling the cops, you risk incriminating yourself. So the first thing is, you can't, basically you're operating in a stateless context. You can't rely on the state to protect and enforce your property rights. The second problem, and this pertains in particular for Cosa Nostra, is they actually forbid members from writing down contracts. And that is also part of the kind of the incrimination component. If you write anything down, then that you jeopardize, or that may, that contract or that written document, whatever that might be, might fall into the wrong hands, be turned over to the police, and bring down the entire organization. And so they avoid that problem by basically banning writing anything down, which creates a whole nother set of problems, unlike a bunch of other criminal organizations, especially. So I could talk a little bit about this because I've been reading and writing about some criminal organizations in Brazil that actually have they have Excel spreadsheets, and they have super specific contract arrangements. They usually use written documents, so it's very interesting. But Cosa Nostra doesn't do that, which is a serious issue, because that means that any agreement between two criminals is going to be highly underspecified relative to kind of the ideal contract. So when you form some sort of agreement with another criminal, there are a bunch of stipulations that you would like to include in the contract, kind of delineating the responsibilities within the agreement or the partnership, that basically remain tacit and undefined, which means that basically the only way that you can make that cooperative relationship work in the long run is to basically agree to sort it out later. It's like, we can't figure it out right now. We'll kind of deal with problems as they come, which means that the demand for kind of future arbitration services is quite high. And so the other kind of key thing or key problem that Cosa Nostra has to contend with relative to other criminal organizations is that they largely don't engage in team production. So they're not like some of the Brazilian criminal organizations or pirates, in which they actually have super delineated and specific responsibilities within the criminal firm. Members within La Cosa Nostra have a incredibly high degree of autonomy to basically do whatever they want. And in fact, they're referred to very frequently as earners. It's like, your responsibility as a member of La Cosa Nostra is to go out and earn. We don't care how you do it, just go out and earn. Now, they do place some constraints on what you can actually do. So they don't want to attract federal attention and federal investigations. So you can't do counterfeiting, and they formally forbid counterfeiting within the organization. They forbid trafficking because that entails violating or breaking federal laws. And so, like, don't engage with it. Everything has to be kind of in state. But within that kind of structure, it's like, you can do whatever you want. Just don't do these things. You end up having a lot of very fleeting relationships and partnerships between Costa Nostra members. So they're like, hey man, do you want to open a bar down this way? Like, okay, that sounds good. I'll do it for like a year and then we're out. Do you want to go and rob these trucks that are coming through? It's got a whole bunch of coats. Like if you guys have seen The Sopranos, like the burglary goes on, plundering of trucks goes on. And, in those kind of short-term ventures, criminal ventures, if you will, it's very costly to delineate the responsibilities within that agreement. And so Costa Nostra has a serious issue, or faces a series of constraints, unlike legitimate firms and unlike many other criminal organizations.
So what I was going to say is we had Josh Wright on the podcast, and he was talking about how the entire point of contracts is like for the contract not to ever have to be, like enforced, like in the courts, right? Like you don't want to ever end up in court. Like that's kind of the whole point of the contract. So when you're not able to actually write anything down, how do you construct, these kinds of agreements to kind of avoid the court in the first place, or these sit downs?
They often so that's an interesting question and something I've thought a decent bit about. One of the things I think is a function of that problem, which is like we just don't want to go to court if we don't have to, is they often rely on share contracting. They're like, okay, whatever profits we make from this particular venture, we're just going to split it so that we don't actually have to like define in particular what it is we're going to do. Now that's going to rely on the cost of measuring output. And so there are going to be certain dissipation or resources destroyed in actually trying to measure output and make sure that one guy's not underselling just how much they actually ended up selling. But I think I don't have enough evidence about these specifics of the contracts that they actually sign between one another, because again, they're verbal and tacit. So I only have kind of anecdotal, but like this is how we did things. I don't have like, here's the precise unwritten stipulations of the contract when we decided to go into this criminal venture. But my kind of anecdotal understanding is that their way of kind of avoiding too many disputes, if you will, was kind of like output sharing. That's basically what they ended up doing.
And another obviously important thing that you stress in your paper of how to avoid conflicts is the role of the courts. Their courts, as you call it, good name for that. Tell us a little bit about both the intra-family within the particular family's court system and then across families. What was the setup? When did members go to the courts? What did they do to resolve these conflicts?
Sure. Right before I get to that, I just want to mention briefly kind of a key component of Costa Nostra that's kind of implicit in this kind of no written contracts component, which is, because contracts are underspecified relative to what they might otherwise prefer, you can anticipate the rate of disputes to be much higher than would otherwise be the case. Okay. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say we're going to sort it out later. It's like, we're just going to get into a fight later and we're going to resolve it as much as we can. And so if contracts were written, you would anticipate the rate of disputes to be much lower. And so disputes are happening quite frequently amongst Costa Nostra members, and that's hence the reputation for beefing. If you guys might, that's kind of a colloquial term for what they do. They're always getting into beast with one another. The other kind of key component with Costa Nostra that these guys are trained in the use of violence. Okay, for many years these guys were expected to actually have committed a murder prior to becoming a full-made member of La Cosa Nostra. And in fact, violence was one of the key ways in which they actually protected their kind of cartel rents. That's another important means of how they actually made money. They could do whatever they want, but they kind of performed a cartel. Like they had implicit non-compete agreements with other families and other members. Okay. But they would use violence against non-members quite frequently. It's like, if you open up a shop or you try and open up some sort of thing that might potentially compete with me, I might firebomb your store. I might break your legs type of thing. Okay. So these guys had a comparative advantage in using violence, which means that they actually had a much lower cost of actually resolving disputes in a violent manner. Okay. So when not only did you have disputes happening in a relatively frequent basis, but any single dispute had a relatively high probability of being resolved in a violent manner. And that was particularly problematic for Cosa Nostra because, again, these guys have to try and avoid detection by the state. And so Cosa Nostra has to try and incentivize its members to take into account or appreciate its low profile. And because its low profile was actually held in common by all of its members, because its profile was held in common by all of its members, members might in fact free ride by resolving disputes in a violent manner. And so the courts, what I try and argue in the paper, is actually the kind of institutional solution to this problem of free riding on the value of its low profile. And the courts,
Let me see
you
if I
might
can
put it this way.
So let me see if I can phrase that in a way to make sure I got the right sense of the public free riding problem. So
Sure.
if you and I get into a fight, that obviously has costs for both you and I, but
Sure.
in addition to that, it has costs on the broader La Costa Nostra because it brings attention, right? And that's the sort of externality you're stressing, is it brings attention to the organization, or is it slightly different than that?
No, that's exactly right. And to give you an example of it, there was a case in Florida where there's a territorial dispute between two mobsters, and one guy basically said, "Hey, I'm gonna like move in on your territory." Another guy said, "No, I would prefer that you not. I'm gonna like tell on you." And then the aggressor was warned in very like in no uncertain terms, like, do not infringe on this guy's territory. And then the defendant basically ended up and shooting the aggressor in public in front of 6 people. And he ended up getting life in prison. And they were attracted far more attention than Cosa Nostra attention wanted at the time. And kind of the big bosses in New York were actually extremely angry with this kind of use of violence in a very public manner. Because to be quite frank, when you commit very public crimes, you're going to attract law enforcement investigations that end up being very costly for the organization, not just because it interrupts your criminal opportunities and ventures, but also because it actually jeopardizes the organization in an existential way. Because if you break too many crimes, everyone's going to get arrested and go to prison. And unlike prison gangs, this is another kind of important difference between Cosa Nostra and prison gangs. Cosa Nostra doesn't control prisons. So prison gangs actually very often control prisons. And so because of high recidivism rates, if you get out of prison and then break the rules of the organization, when you get back in, there's a very high probability that you'll be punished. Cosa Nostra doesn't operate in the same way because they don't control prisons. They actually have to go to the lengths of the earth to try and prevent their guys from going to prison and avoiding attention. And so these Costa Nostra courts, what I try and argue, are a way of basically reducing the cost of resolving disputes in an amicable and mutually agreeable manner, and therefore avoiding unnecessary public attention by law enforcement and media more generally. And one of the things I came to appreciate about the courts is that they're surprisingly formal. There's a surprising degree of formality about these courts. So you might anticipate that courts run by criminals on behalf of other criminals would kind of reflect their reputation for violence and capriciousness, but that wasn't actually the case. So they actually had jurisdictions across territories. One family in Philadelphia couldn't basically arbitrate a dispute there was no judge shopping, right? So you actually had to, and bosses would actually refuse to resolve disputes that were committed or resolve disputes that occurred in someone else's territory. And they also had a relatively formal process in the sense that there was a proper procedure. So Cosa Nostra has a paramilitary structure. You have soldiers at the bottom. You've got they're not literally middle managers because they don't do a whole lot of management, but the capos are in the middle, and then you've got bosses at the top of any individual family. And soldiers were often getting disputes because they're primarily the earners of the organization. And so when any single dispute occurred between soldiers, it was their responsibility to immediately notify their captain, the guy immediately above them, of the dispute. And the captain would then try and come to some sort of informal agreement, like, hey guys, can we settle this out of court? But very often that wasn't the case. At which point the the captain would notify the boss, and a formal trial date was actually set. And uh, on the official date, everybody who was relevant to the particular dispute would show up, and the boss would basically preside as judge, and the captains would actually act as lawyers for their own soldiers. And so the soldiers actually weren't supposed to talk a whole lot. It was the responsibility of the captains to basically argue on behalf of their clients, defendant and litigant, or the litigants. And then the judge was customarily responsible for producing some sort of mutually agreeable conclusion amongst the guys. And he actually had an incentive to do so, because he had an encompassing interest in the criminal affairs of his members. So he was basically paid a percentage of anything that the soldiers kicked up, a percentage of criminal profits to the captains, who would then pay another percentage up to the boss. And so that kind of encompassing interest, a la Olson, actually incentivized bosses to produce resolutions that kept disputes low grade, because if they didn't, then the dispute remained at risk of escalation, turning into a violent dispute, and ultimately, again, bringing unnecessary and unwanted attention to the organization that might jeopardize in an existential way the organization, but also hurts everybody else's criminal profits.
I hadn't thought about it up to this point. You're explaining it when I was reading the paper, but there's interesting that the captains need to defend them. You can imagine, I wouldn't want, if I was a captain, you wouldn't want to be defending these ridiculous claims. And so the captain has kind of another monitoring incentive in the meantime to try to avoid being in front of the boss trying to argue this, this dumb case. In the same way that a lawyer at a private company, a lawyer at a corporation will try to cut off things before we get to court at all, so we don't have to again I'm going to be the one putting my neck out, looking like an idiot, trying to defend the bozo that got in a fight.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. And the other thing I would add on top of that is, it's not often the case, at least this is my understanding from a couple of pieces of evidence, that the captains were basically not paid for this service that they provided. They were basically responsible, basically doing it for free, which is like ensuring that they would only take to. This is the way I'm kind of thinking about it, is like, that incentivizes them to ensure that they're not basically sticking their neck out on behalf of the defendant for something that's like completely ridiculous, right? So there's another kind of clever key institutional design that we wouldn't anticipate criminals being able to produce, but in fact they can.
So I think one of the things is like, what the primary role of the court here seems to be is to kind of maintain this public good, right? And so like the idea is that you want to you don't want to bring any attention to yourself, and so these courts are kind of serving that role. And so when I think about this, we start to think about, well, how do we know that that's what the court is really doing? And so, but I guess that brings two questions to mind. So the first thing is like, is there any evidence that they don't that they actually don't care about violence if it's not visible, right? So for example, if they just disappear somebody and nobody really knows, and there's they have and they have plausible deniability, right? Do they just not care, or is this something that goes to court? And then the other thing is like, how does this compare with other criminal organizations and different mafia organizations, and how they handle these kinds of things?
So they definitely have a concern with particularly public crimes. And that's like, you kind of get the sense that we know that from, first of all, they're forbidding members from engaging in counterfeiting and trafficking and stuff like that. It's like, because those are particularly ostensibly much more public crimes because you're breaking federal law, and therefore it, like, apparently the Fed, the kind of the story goes, the feds are much harder to corrupt, and therefore we don't want to attract their attention in any way. And then, but when it comes to like, okay, how can we really be sure that these courts are designed in order to preserve this Costa Nostra's low profile? I've used secrecy in the past, just to kind of help us think about it as an asset. It's like we have this asset that's held in common by all of it, or like reputation. It's kind of analogous to reputation in a way. And we have all of this. We have all these kind of franchisees, if you will, who have an incentive to free ride on the value of this good that's held in common. And how can we be sure that these institutions, these court institutions, are in fact solving that problem and not solving the problem of, say, violence per se? So violence is costly. We don't want to spend all of our money actually fighting one another. The money we spend on guns and going to the hospital and taking guys to the hospital has an opportunity cost and could be reinvested in some sort of criminal enterprise. So how do we kind of delineate, or at least rule out, one of the two hypotheses? And what I try and do in the forthcoming version of the paper is I look at three key pieces of evidence. So the first one concerns the institution's efficiency and effectiveness. So basically, if these courts are doing what I suggest that they're doing, which is to kind of keep disputes low grade so as to avoid detection or attention rather, then at the very least, a minimum condition for that is that they actually do a good job of keeping disputes low grade. And in fact, they really, ostensibly they did. And there are two key pieces of evidence that suggest that. First of all, members routinely laud these institutions as doing a pretty good job of keeping institutions low grade. So they're like, you know, these are arguments, these beats are happening all the time. And without these institutions, things would be all up in flames, basically. The second thing is bosses actually spent a great deal of their time, pardon me, they spent a great deal of their time actually resolving disputes. These guys are not they're not like managers who are telling everybody what to do. Like I said, the members have a great deal of autonomy to do whatever they do. So like, what are the bosses doing? The bosses actually spend a great deal of their time being judges and resolving disputes. And if they were bad at that, the demand for their arbitration services would actually be quite low. But that actually wasn't the case. There's a great quote in an FBI file talking about Angelo Bruno, who's the boss of the Philadelphia family. And the informant basically describes Bruno as running around in Philadelphia, always trying to resolve disputes. And that's an indication of the fact that he actually did a pretty good job, because if he didn't, people would look elsewhere. They would basically find some other means of resolving the dispute. So that's kind of the first key piece of evidence. The second thing, we would love to see, in an ideal world, we would love to see an organization that doesn't value its secrecy or its low profile, and see how its institutions differ from that of La Cosa Nostra, right? And thankfully, we actually have an organization that's extremely similar to La Cosa Nostra in a couple of very important ways. So first of all, they share important customs. Second of all, they're similar in size. And third of all, they are a mafia type organization. And this is the 'Ndrangheta, which is a Calabrian, it's a mafia type organization from Calabria in southern Italy. Okay. Now there's a key difference between these organizations. 'Ndrangheta has a reputation for not really caring about its low profile, which is which sharply contrasts with La Cosa Nostra. And so we should anticipate that an organization or a mafia, it's comprised of clans, the 'Ndrangheta. And so we should anticipate these clans, or the 'Ndrangheta more generally, to not really care about resolving disputes in a violent manner. And in fact, they didn't. Historically, they practiced blood feuding and vendetta in a way that Cosa Nostra absolutely didn't. And in fact, it's such an important practice within the 'Ndrangheta that Calabria is one of the most dangerous places for mafia, what's the phrase that I use in the paper? Men of honor. It's another synonym for mafia members. And so the rates of kind of mafia related murders are much, much higher in Calabria than in, say, a place like New York. And in fact, the whole practice of blood feuding and vendetta is like, if there's an offense against you, then not only is everybody in your family responsible for helping you basically seek vengeance, but you are obligated to do so. And Drangheta didn't, and so the rates of violence are much, much higher. And Drangheta didn't have effective or formal dispute resolution systems in the same way that the La Cosa Nostra did. And it wasn't really up until 1991 they had a kind of their in a really important moment when there's a particularly violent war, one of the most violent wars amongst Drangheta clans in its history. I think 700 people died in a span of 5 or 6 years. And at that point, that was attracting a lot of attention, and which raised the value of Drangheta's low profile, at which point all of a sudden the benefits of creating effective and formal dispute resolution systems and courts exceeded the costs, and they created their own version of what's called it's called La Provincia, but it's basically analogous to Cosa Nostra's Supreme Court, which in English we call the Commission. Okay. And so an organization that basically doesn't care about the low profile actually has much higher rate, doesn't have the same institutions, and also has much higher rates of violence. And then the last piece, and I'll only talk about this very briefly, is the history of the American Cosa Nostra. So basically, the American Cosa Nostra didn't create its own Supreme Court, its own commission, up until the early 1930s. And that story is actually very similar to the Drangheta. There was a particularly violent war amongst all of the members that attracted way too much attention for the higher ups within La Cosa Nostra. And at that point, they're like, we need to create an institution that's going to, in perpetuity, help keep disputes low grade. Because if we don't, I have a great quote. It's like, if we don't, then if the bodies keep piling up in the streets, we're going to violate we're going to jeopardize our very strong relationship with law enforcement. And so we need to preserve a low profile. And so, pardon me, the timing of the Cosa Nostra's creation of the commission was a particularly important, I think, piece of evidence in favor of the low profile preserving function of these dispute resolution systems. And the one thing last thing I'll say, the competing argument, again, as I mentioned earlier, is like, okay, well, could these institutions just be designed to keep you from spending money on equipment and fighting one another? Okay. That hypothesis faces at least one obstacle, which is the Drangheta. So if we should anticipate the Drangheta, because they're engaging in some violence, to actually have the most robust court system, basically, because they engage in a practice of blood feuding and vendetta, and in fact they don't. Empirically, they really don't. And so as a result, we can at least be considerably, I think, with all of those features in mind, or all of those pieces of evidence in mind, we can be considerably more confident of the kind of secrecy enhancing or secrecy preserving function of Cosa Nostra Courts, as opposed to kind of violence reducing function of Cosa Nostra Courts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The comparison. I won't try to say anything in Italian, but the comparison of the different organizations. In particular, you haven't talked about it for a little bit, but earlier you mentioned the federal system or the federal enforcements, right?
Yeah.
Presumably, the reason that matters is, and you touched on this as well, that the New York families are able to buy off the New York. At least, let's take the 1960s period, or, the New York families are able to buy off the New York enforcement, but they're not able to buy off the feds. The feds are just too big for them to be able to handle that. Where in Italy, I'm assuming the reason that they can get away with blood feuds is because they are able to buy off, in whatever sense buy off means. They're able to buy off the much smaller local police force.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. They basically, if you think about intimidation and bribery as substitutes. So, like, in terms of keeping your guys out of prison, you have a couple of means with which to do that. You could basically avoid attention, you could bribe key witnesses, or you could intimidate key witnesses. And as it turns out, the cost of bribery and intimidation in Italy are much, much lower than in the United States. And so they're going to substitute on the margin they will economize. And rather than spending all this money trying to keep disputes low grade, they'll just bribe and intimidate key witnesses and keep their guys out of jail that way. And so the kind of high levels of corruption in Italy is actually a very important part of my argument. And I will say, just as an aside, as an empirical, Italy actually is a really interesting empirical puzzle. It's an open question for any graduate students who want to try and figure this out. It is one of the most developed and corrupt countries in the world. Why that's the case is it's still an open question. I remember reading a book and he's like, here are 15 different factors that could explain Italy's relatively high levels of corruption and its relatively high levels of development. Okay, that doesn't really help. But I think it's a really important kind of empirical puzzle.
So I have two confusions about two things that don't make sense to me about the way things operate, and they're not necessarily things that you've touched on, so I understand if we don't have a perfect answer, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on them. So the first is, so secrecy is this asset that's valuable to the organization. At the same time, you've stressed in the paper, I forget if you said it today, but you stressed in the paper that we're working with people who have a comparative advantage in violence. Okay, it's an organization that's going to be violent. This shows up in the discussion of pirates as well and other gangs, that you're kind of starting the pool with violent people, and so therefore you're more likely to have violence, so on and so forth. But why require on admission murder? If you're trying to, why on the one hand are you trying to, keep law enforcement at bay, keep secrecy, at the same time encouraging a particular murder on condition of entrance?
Mm-hmm. So one really important reason, my understanding is that federal agents can't participate in a murder. So if you don't want federal agents basically entering the organization, one really good way of making sure you don't have federal agents get in the organization is have them commit a murder or participate in a murder, right? And so it's a clever way of basically screening out people who would otherwise jeopardize the sanctity of the organization. And you can kind of also think about it like a sacrifice and stigma, Yannicone club goods model type thing, which is you have this secrecy component. There's going to be potential free riding, and so you can't select amongst high effort agents and low effort agents, and so you're going to have the guys impose a very high cost on themselves before they enter the organization, so as to economize on monitoring costs once they're in.
And presumably they're not the murder they're supposed to do on admission is not a random one. It's one that the organization believes will have minimal attention to it anyway. So you're able to minimize the attention while still having the sorting function to keep out federal agents or even local agents as well.
Correct. And I'll just add, the boss has a monopoly on ordering a murder. So members don't have the authority to just go around and murder random people. The boss actually has the sole authority to order a hit on anyone. And it's not just a de jure rule, which is I'll just commit this guy and then it was actually de facto. There are tons of examples within the FBI files of guys actually going to the boss hey, this guy's really irritating me, or this guy's losing me a lot of money. Can we have this guy disappeared? And the boss will often say no. It's no, I don't think so. This guy's too important to this guy, or this guy's too important to this guy. And so and the guy obviously ends up surviving. So it was taken very committing a murder was taken very, very seriously within La Costa Nostra. Again, because of this low profile issue, you don't want to commit murders for which the costs exceed the benefits, right?
Well, what I was going to say is, where do you kind of see this going? So this is all about La Costa Nostra, but is this kind of a bigger project, just studying organized crime, or so is there interest in looking at other I don't know, I guess in the United States, we tend to have organized crime sort of organized by ethnicity or something like that. But do you have any plans to sort of do maybe like comparative analysis between the different types of organized crime? And well, I'll let you do that one first, and then we can circle back to it.
Okay. Yeah. So I definitely do. What the things that really interest me are the following. First of all, how do societies incentivize their judges to rule correctly? And that happens to relate to, I think, in the case with which I want to explore that question is criminals and criminal organizations. So I've just recently started a project focusing on some of the prison gangs in Brazil. And in particular, the PCC and the CV are notorious for, the PCC in particular, are notorious for producing actually super effective dispute resolution services. And I only recently learned about this. And so it blew my mind when that was the case. I'm like, I thought it was like the only guy who was doing stuff on criminal courts, but there's a political science professor, Lessing at U Chicago, who's has a very, very interesting paper on the PCC. But in any event, and he gets to leverage all this. Again, he basically got a bunch of the files of the PCC, all these spreadsheets and everything. And so he's an awesome paper. But in any event, I want to try and understand and explain variations in how different societies that are ostensibly criminal actually incentivize their judges to rule appropriately. And then the second thing I want to try and understand is thinking more seriously about unwritten contracts as a binding constraint, and how that will shape the institutions of different societies and or criminal organizations. Because to my mind, I haven't found anything or anybody who's tried to write on that. And I think it's particularly important because it's a unique constraint. It's like, when you enter an agreement, how do you incentivize your partner? Or in a principal agent problem, how do you incentivize your partner to actually not be opportunistic, not underinvest, and basically screw you over? And so I imagine or anticipate certain institutions will emerge in order to solve that problem. But what those are, it's not entirely clear to me yet. So kind of the overarching, kind of to bring it all around, I want to understand how criminal judges operate, not just like judges who rule on crime, but like judges who are criminals ruling on behalf of criminals, how they operate. And then also want to understand how people trade in super kind of information scarce contexts, and how cooperation develops in those sorts of contexts. And those are kind of two complementary kind of research programs I'm pushing forward.
Well, it's definitely related, tie everything back to Elshin, right? It's related to Crawford, Elchin, Klein type of stuff, or Klein's work more generally. Yep. on reputation, all this unspecified contracts. It actually brings up another question I had. I'll go back a little bit to La Costa Nostra, but one thing that struck me in reading your paper and some of the background stuff is just how many things, both legitimate and illegitimate, the organization was involved with. Lots of, we've mentioned some of them, but wouldn't, again, this is a confusion I have, wouldn't it be easier, like, I don't need to write a contract with my barber because I know what the barber for me is a big deal, and like Josh, it matters. Right? I have one thing, the barber does one thing, it's simple, we don't have a contract, so on and so forth. Why have such, and if there's a dispute that arises, it would tend to be one of a few things, right? They somehow hurt me, they cut the hair wrong, wouldn't it be easier to get along without writing contracts if you just do one thing? Why have such a wide-ranging, enterprise where you give the members the ability to do whatever they want? They can run if they want to run a legitimate pizza shop, they can do that.
Yeah.
Why not just we do three things: we rob trucks, we sell drugs, we do something else. I don't know.
So, to be clear, I don't know. And the fact that they're super diversified, they engage in a bunch of, like, I think in the paper I list like probably 10 different things in which any member might actually have a kind of criminal interest in actually operating. So they're super, super diversified. Any one guy's not doing one thing. And I want to contrast that with like some of the PCC from Brazil, for example. If you actually look at an individual level, kind of like the unit level of a Brazilian drug trafficker, they have people whose entire responsibility it is to package drugs. They have another guy whose sole responsibility is to guard the drugs. There's another guy whose responsibility is to sell the drugs. They have another guy who's responsible for managing the place at which the drugs are sold. So they have extreme, like the delineation of responsibilities within the criminal firm in Brazil is much, much finer as opposed to La Costa Nostra, which is partly why I think the dispute rate is much, much higher, because you're always trying to do something else. But why Costa Nostra has its members, or gives its members the degree of autonomy that it does, is not entirely clear to me. My intuition is that it has to do with the quality of governance, like the one way in which to avoid detection and avoid existential threats is to basically keep yourself super flat and super thin and keep people spaced apart. And like, if you want to think about like network, you want to have as few connections between people as possible. And when you have everybody like who is working together basically in one place doing one particular thing, those guys face a much higher threat of, like, when the police come in, everybody goes to jail. But with Costa Nostra, they can kind of avoid that by keeping everything super spread out and kind of at arm's length.
And if you're if you're in a geographic region like a city, I mean, yes, you can keep splitting up the city into smaller and smaller cocaine regions, but at some point it makes sense to diversify. And okay, you're not going to be competing with the cocaine, the member who has the monopoly on cocaine. You can do something else without interfering in it.
Yeah.
So maybe I didn't understand this right, but like one aspect of this that I found, or that I thought was interesting, is sort of, it seems like they let the members just be kind of like entrepreneurs. So if you decide you want to do this thing, fine, you go off and do the thing, and then they just kind of let them go do it, right? You just decide like, oh, I'm gonna I'm gonna start this bookmaking business or something like that, and they're like, yeah, go ahead. And like, it's just kind of like everybody's just kind of developing their own business, but it's all sort of within the same organization. It's like it's like a giant multinational corporation or something like that, right? We're just producing a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I need to take some of those management books that try to encourage entrepreneurship, or is that what they call it? Whatever. They're way ahead of their time.
It's funny that you say that, because I've been talking to a professor, and I think we're gonna start working on a paper. I think her background is management and entrepreneurship, and apparently no one's done stuff on the entrepreneurial nature of criminals. And so turns out that these guys are super entrepreneurial. And I also want to just emphasize, I think it'd be really cool to do a paper. It's like, what does criminal management have to tell to like non-criminal management about how they could like manage the firm more efficiently? And one of the things that I've noticed is it's also the case that bosses can kind of act as venture capitalists. So they'll get propositions all the time. Guys will be like, hey, I have this kind of criminal arrangement that I could do. It's like, I need you to lend me this money and put me in connection with this guy. What do you think? And bosses will be like, yes, no. And they'll make a decision. I don't know. But I've only had a couple of instances. What I do know is that they're always being propositioned. But they very frequently don't like manage it. It's like often kept at arm's length. It's like they're kind of criminal. They're criminal angel investors, if you will, and people are competing for their investment.
Well, that's exciting. That's exciting to see more what we can learn in entrepreneurship and management. Something I work a little bit on from these criminal organizations. A lot to learn. Well, thanks again, Henry. We'll put a link in the show notes. That's Fancy Think Podcast. People say we'll put a link in the show notes to Henry's website and Henry's paper. I'm excited to see what Josh and Henry do at Ole Miss with a new law and econ program. So thanks, Henry.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you both very much. I really enjoyed it. I got some really, really good questions and more food for thought. So I really do appreciate it. And, I'm looking forward to seeing you guys both in person, hopefully sometime soon.